Welcome to the Honors Level Extensions for Standard 2. This presentation covers the additional information that students in the Honors Level courses are expected to know in Standard 2 above and beyond the state standards of learning. These extensions for Standard 2 really focus on the first two parts of the standard, 2A and 2B. We have an additional empire that we're responsible for knowing, and a number of additional Renaissance artists. So we'll start off with the extension to Standard 2A. And students in the honors courses are also expected to know in 1500 the location of the Holy Roman Empire. I'll be honest, I'm surprised this isn't part of the state standards given the role that the Holy Roman Empire plays, especially in the early part of the course. But located here in Central Europe, much of or pretty much modern day Germany and many of the surrounding countries. You learned a little bit about the Holy Roman Empire in your World One course. Hopefully you remember the name Charlemagne. He's the guy who unified this area under his control. Much of Western Europe, by the time of his death in 814, was under the control of Charlemagne, who was the first Holy Roman Emperor. However, his son wasn't able to hold the empire together, and by 843, the empire was in the hands of his grandsons, Charles, Lothar, and Louis. The three of them didn't get along too well. They were always fighting with each other. So the empire experienced constant fighting, and by 1500, the empire was really the lands that had once been controlled by Lothar and Louis. Ironically, kind of foreshadowing the course, by the time we get to the 20th century, these areas in red, kind of Germany, the northern part of Italy, are really the same parts of Europe that we'll see in by the time we get to World War II. So this family feud back in the 1800s in many ways plants the seeds for much more modern events and conflicts in Europe. But we do want to know the location of the Holy Roman Empire on a map in 1500. Okay, moving on to Standard 2B, we have quite a few of these Renaissance artists that we need to know. In the state standards, we only are responsible for Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. As honors students, we want you to know a few additional artists. Our first one here is Donatello, even earlier than Michelangelo and Leonardo. Donatello sculpts an important statue called David, not to be confused with Michelangelo's David, but it is the same character, the biblical figure David who kills the giant Goliath. Donatello's David is the first freestanding, meaning not connected to a building or part of another sculpture, first freestanding bronze sculpture since way back in ancient times. So kind of a big turning point here in Renaissance art. It shows David standing on top of the severed head of the giant Goliath. In the biblical story, David, the regular human, taking down the giant-sized Goliath. Okay, and there we see a detail of Goliath's head and David's foot standing firmly on top of dead Goliath's head. David was a popular figure in Renaissance art, particularly in Florence, because the Florentines saw their little city of Florence as small but powerful and surrounded by Goliaths, city-states that were bigger and richer and stronger, who were envious and wanting to take over Florence. We also see a famous sculpture here called Magdalene the Penitent, and Magdalene in this case referring also to a biblical figure, Mary Magdalene, one of the women who followed Jesus and his disciples. One of the stories of Mary Magdalene is that after Jesus' death, she went out into the desert to be alone and reflect. To be penitent means to be sorrowful, remorseful. And the story goes, she was out in the desert for 30 years on her own, just barely surviving. Pre-Renaissance art typically portrayed Mary Magdalene, even though she was out for 30 years in the desert, that her spiritual side was nourishing her. She was fed according to the stories, by the angels out in the desert. And so she didn't look any worse for wear. We see here Donatello and the early humanism of the Renaissance kind of focusing more not on what her spiritual side sort of preserving her, but just what her human side just barely surviving out in the desert. We really see a very lifelike portrayal of her physical characteristics and her physical condition as the result of being 30 years out in the desert on her own. Okay, another Renaissance artist we need to know is Sandro Botticelli. And Botticelli, also in the late 1400s, paints two famous paintings, among others, but two that he's particularly known for. The Birth of Venus, which in many ways captures the spirit of rebirth that was characteristic of the Renaissance. Once again, Botticelli, like a lot of Renaissance artists, goes back to the Romans for here the Roman goddess Venus, okay, and a portrayal of her birth. But again, it's that realism, it's that attention to detail just we see in the face of Venus here. The reflection in the eyes, the shadowing on the face. This is the kind of attention to detail that Renaissance artists prided themselves on. Botticelli, noted for painting women in his paintings. Another one of these is La Primavera, or the spring, which also goes back to Roman themes. Most art historians consider this painting as a couple of Roman poets' stories combined into sort of the birth of spring here, the La Primavera being spring. And once again, we see the central characters being women in Botticelli's work. So La Primavera and Birth of Venus, two works to know by Botticelli. Okay, we move to the north. As we saw in Standard 2B, the Renaissance moved from its Italian beginnings up into Northern Europe, into what's now Belgium, Holland, and we meet the artist Jan van Eyck in what's now Belgium. Jan van Eyck, the Northern Renaissance tended to be a little bit darker. The paintings, the themes tended to be a little bit darker, even darker in the sense a lot of them were indoors, because Northern Europe, climate-wise, a little bit colder than the Mediterranean area around Italy. We see here a famous painting called the Arnolfini Wedding. And this is a painting, typically students looking at this, we see here Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfini on their wedding day, but the picture is not taking place in a church. Okay, if we look at our painting, it appears that they're standing in a bedroom, or at least a room in a house, as opposed to in a church. If you look closely at Mrs. Arnolfini, it does appear that she's pregnant. And most art historians consider that a key to the painting, that at this time, Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfini really wouldn't have been welcome to a church wedding due to her being pregnant before being married. So a lot of art historians assume that this is pretty much almost their wedding certificate, okay, their wedding license. And Van Eyck painting this painting of them and giving witness to the fact that they exchange vows. Van Eyck was kind of revolutionary in his use of a new kind of paint. Okay, he used oil paint, which gave his paintings a real lifelike quality. And we can kind of see, if we look right over their hands towards the focal point, the vanishing point in the back of the painting, we see this very detailed mirror. Okay, and we can see, if you look closely at the picture, we can see the backs of Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfini. Okay, we see them here. She's wearing a green dress. He's wearing kind of a dark color. We see them reflected. And that bit of blue in the back, that's Van Eyck himself. Okay, he's painted his reflection as though he's there witnessing this wedding between this couple. Okay, so the Arnolfini wedding we want to know for Van Eyck. Van Eyck also paints this picture, the Annunciation. Another very religious painting, but one that kind of focuses more on the realism and the detail. If you look close, you see most of the space is the building itself. It's as though Van Eyck is almost more interested in painting the physical structure that the two characters are in than the religious figures themselves. The woman in blue is Mary in Christianity, and the figure on the left is the angel Gabriel announcing to Mary that she's going to give birth to Jesus. But again, it's that attention to detail both in the figures and in the building. We see Renaissance techniques like perspective. We see how the picture has some depth as it moves into the background. We also see this attention to detail if we zero in on the floor tiles. At the bottom of the painting, we can see just the incredible detail that Van Eyck paints into the tiles themselves. He paints actual biblical scenes in the paintings, but we also see things like zodiac signs painted in where the painting or the biblical scenes come together. So this just ridiculous level of detail that Van Eyck and Renaissance artists put into their work, and Van Eyck in particular, the use of oil paint allowing him to come with this very lifelike look to his paintings. Okay, another Renaissance or Italian Renaissance artist. Here we see Raphael. Raphael paints the School of Athens in the early 1500s. Athens, once again, being a city in Greece, and Athens, the center of Greek civilization. Raphael painted all that he could think of the famous Greeks. He clustered them together in different groups here. So we see in the center of the painting here Plato and Aristotle. Okay, the two of the key figures in ancient Greek civilization. But it's not just the ancient Greeks themselves. He paints into the painting Michelangelo. Okay, so all these famous Greeks from centuries earlier, he decides to include Michelangelo, one of his contemporaries. And if you take a look at this picture here, we see four figures. I want you to take a look at Raphael's face. That's a self-portrait of Raphael on the left, and we can see his own face here. So he's painted himself into this gathering of famous and important people. It's very much that idea of humanism, focusing on individual talents and abilities. We also see here another example of Raphael's work called the Sistine Madonna. Maybe not as famous in itself as some of the other paintings, but we see two characters down here at the bottom that you may be familiar with. These two angels down at the bottom are quite familiar and appear in many things. Even though they're angels, they're religious figures, their faces are so human. You know, they have the look of little kids, or not little kids, if, you know, maybe even you might have the same look on your faces listening to these recordings, but, you know, Raphael's thinking maybe angels get bored floating around up in the sky, so they kind of have that very human expression that some of you might be having about now. Okay, that brings us to our last artist, another northern artist. Raphael got mixed up in there. I should have had Raphael before Van Eyck. But Albrecht Dürer, another northern Renaissance artist. And like I said, the northern artists were very much darker in their perspective and their view of life. We see Dürer's Night, Death, and the Devil, a very descriptive title for the three main characters. We see here the knight on horseback, this is death in front of him and the devil behind him. The knight is on his horse riding out to battle. And if we take a look at the detail here we see the character of Death looking right up at the knight as he rides off to battle. And if we see in Death's hands, he's holding up an hourglass. Okay, people didn't wear wristwatches or have clocks the same way we do. It's like he's warning the knight, your time's almost up. Okay, the hourglass, the sand is almost run all the way through. And then another example of religious art, but again being very much focused on the detail, are praying hands, this close-up engraving that Dürer did of two hands in prayer. So this concludes our extensions for Standard 2, and that's it.